We've talked on the show with many men who have spent decades of their lives wrongfully in prison before the convictions were overturned. People like Sean Ellis, 22 years, Darrell Jones, 32 years, Fred Clay, 38 years. But the man whose case we're going to talk about tonight, 28-year-old C.J. Rice from my hometown of Philadelphia, is still in prison for a shooting he has always maintained he had nothing to do with. Back in 2011, 4 people were shot in a street in South Philly, all of whom later recovered. There was no physical evidence tying anyone to the crime, and witnesses told police multiple times they did not know who was responsible, only able to describe 2 figures, both black, wearing hoodies and sweatpants. But after police said they got a tip from a confidential informant naming Rice, the witnesses changed their stories, identifying Rice and a friend. According to a terrific cover piece in The Atlantic by CNN anchor Jake Tapper, Rice, then 17 years old, wasn't actually worried about the case at first. He thought the matter would be cleared up quickly because he had still been recovering from surgery and some major complications after having been shot himself. He was wrong, and Rice's court-appointed attorney did not help. Just about the only thing she did in the case was cash her check. Rice was convicted of attempted murder, sentenced to 30 to 60 years in prison. In the Atlantic piece, Jake Tapper writes, Rice lacked legal representation worthy of the name. Jake joins me along with his father, Dr. Theodore Tapper, who had Mr. Rice as a patient from childhood until right after he was shot. Dr. Jake, thanks so much for being here.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Doctor, you saw CJ a couple of weeks after he'd gotten treatment for getting shot himself. What kind of condition was he in?
He could barely walk. He was walking with a great deal of pain. He had trouble getting from the seat in the exam room up to the exam table, and then concomitantly getting back from the exam table to the seat. And when he walked out of the office, he walked with a shuffling gait, all bent over. When feeling his abdomen, he was in a great deal of pain, and he had somewhere between 35 and 40 staples that had been stapled his belly together after the surgery.
So, Jake, less than a week after that moment, that examination by your father, the shooting occurs for which C.J. Rice is accused, tried, convicted, as I said, sentenced to 30 to 60 years. At first, there's no physical evidence. At first, the eyewitnesses were unable to make an identification. What caused the epiphany?
Well, there were 2 witnesses, and as you noted in your introduction, neither of them, neither of them identified or said they knew who the shooters were multiple times. But then a confidential informant supposedly told the police that CJ was involved. The next day, the detectives investigating the case went to visit these 2 women in the hospital and presented them with photo police lineups. And lo and behold, one identified CJ and the other one identified CJ's friend Tyler, who was a co-defendant in the case, although he was completely acquitted. And this is, I should note, the only evidence against CJ, the only evidence. And yet, because Sanjay Weaver, his court-appointed attorney, was so incompetent, she was not able to, or she just simply did not visit the crime scene, apparently, did not underline the fact that the eyewitness testimony was shaky at best, did not make the best use out of my father as a witness because she never met with him before the trial, and on and on. It was a litany of mistakes, and some of those mistakes, especially when it came to the alibi witnesses, actually ended up making CJ look more guilty because she called at least one person to the stand who was not with CJ at the time. It was a travesty of justice. No police force, in my view, would have arrested me for the exact same crime with that little evidence. And if they had, I would have been able to afford an attorney who would have gotten the case dismissed very quickly.
And I assume most of our viewers know there's a 6th Amendment to the Constitution which guarantees a right to counsel. We'll talk about that in a couple of seconds. Even though the lawyer did not speak to you, Dr. Tapper, you did testify at the trial. In your opinion, and by the way, those witnesses said the assailants sprinted away from the scene. Was C.J. Rice physically capable of either committing the crime or sprinting away from the scene a week after you saw him?
It was approximately 5 days after he saw him when the incident occurred. There's no way he was even walking fast. There's no way he was running. And let me add one other thing. The only reason that CJ is sentenced to 30 to 60 years is because the judge, who was the one in charge of this, decided that the concurrent, potentially, sentences of 10 to 15 were to be run consecutively. So 10 to 15 plus 10 to 15 plus 10 to 15 adds up to 30 to 60. If the judge had sentenced him to 3 concurrent terms of 10 to 15, he would have been out by now because it would have been 10 to 15.
You know, this may be an impossible or even a stupid question to ask Jake Tapper, but even the most simple things, for example, getting her client's phone records, which might have had location information, she failed to do. What do you attribute this what you call rank incompetence to?
Well, she has passed away, Sanjay Weaver, so I don't know. I can tell you that since this story came out in the Atlantic, I was contacted by somebody who served in the prosecutor's office who knew a lot of the players, was shocked by the case, but also said to me that Sanjay Weaver was known as a bad lawyer, just that she was commonly known as a crummy lawyer. And one of the things that this researching the story really made me aware of, though I guess I had known it intellectually, you really don't see it until you see it, which is the right to counsel that we have in this country is kind of a joke. The standards are very vague, and individuals who have been found during their trial, defense attorneys, to have been drinking the equivalent of 20 shots of vodka a day, people who fell asleep during the trial, people who were disbarred during the trial, all of them were found by appellate courts to have been sufficiently good counsel. The standard is very, very, very low.
I just want to clarify something. When you said people fell asleep during the trial, the people you're talking about is the lawyer himself or herself, correct? Who fell asleep during the trial?
Yeah, a defense attorney who fell asleep during a trial was found. That's fine. The appellate court ruled that's fine. And look, don't take my. And people can Google this for themselves. I mean, there's case after case of this where the standard is if the attorney has a pulse and is in the room, pretty much that's good enough.
Yeah, you should say, I'm a former civil legal services lawyer myself, and I know a lot of public defenders. For people who don't know the system, Pennsylvania, my home state, and Massachusetts, my adopted state, have the same split. Roughly 20% of indigent defendants are represented by salaried public defenders, the rest by court-appointed lawyers, many of whom are terrific, but all of whom have to work for chicken feed. And in part, that was apparently part of the problem here. This woman had huge financial problems, and I get the sense from your story, her goal was to mount up as many cases and fees as she could, rather than worry about the representation.
Yeah,
she was desperate for money.
As you know, public defenders are often quite excellent, and I don't want to cast aspersions on court-appointed attorneys. Studies indicate they have a much worse track record than public defenders. But what we know about Sanjay is she had to declare bankruptcy several times, and CJ's impression was that she only visited him twice in jail before trial, twice.
15 months, right? In 15 months.
Yeah, very short amounts of time. And according to CJ, she would come with just a giant stack of folders as if she was visiting several clients. And as you know, they get paid by the case, not by the result.
And not by the amount of work you put into it. I'm sorry, doctor, go ahead.
Not by the time they put in either.
Right.
You know, one of the things that really surprised me about it, so the legal appeals, correct me if I'm wrong, gentlemen, vis-a-vis the right to counsel being violated have been exhausted. So it appears that the only avenues left for Mr. Rice is the prosecutor in this case, one of the progressive prosecutors, like we had Rachel Rollins, now promoted to U.S. Attorney, Larry Krasner there, and a commutation proceeding. I want to talk about both. Krasner, it appears to me, Jake Tapper, has totally washed his hands of this, and I don't quite get it. Do you?
Well, I mean, he came to office saying that he was going to he's setting up this thing called the Conviction Integrity Unit, the CIU. That unit has pretty much focused on the most
Egregious.
incontrovertible instances of injustice, crooked cops, evidence that individuals didn't do it. He's not taking on, by the way, I mean, he's also in the middle of a political crisis himself because the Pennsylvania legislature is threatening to impeach him. They're investigating him. And so he's got his hands full with a lot of things. But the bottom line is this is an indictment of the system, not an indictment of a crooked cop or DNA evidence that makes it open and shut for Larry Krasner.
But he's not precluded from looking into these kinds of issues, nor is any DA with these units. I want to mention one other thing, if I can, gentlemen, is the whole commutation process, which I know is what lays out there as potential for Mr. Rice, which is also laden with lots of institutional problems. I mean, we had a Willie Horton here that many people think might have cost Michael Dukakis the presidency, a guy who went on a weekend furlough, a murderer, went out, committed armed robbery, raped a woman, and it became a huge issue in the campaign. Many people think, I myself included, racism conjured up by Governor Dukakis' opponent. But there's a guy, Reginald McFadden in Pennsylvania, a similar situation where the Democrat running against Tom Ridge at the time was winning by 8 or 10 points, and his campaign totally disappeared once a comparable situation came out where a guy was released, a murderer, and then committed murder again. The system is such, Jake, that even progressive governors like Deval Patrick here, very few commutations and pardons. Charlie Baker is only doing them in his 8th and final year. That's a system that also needs a bit of a spotlight, don't you think?
Yeah, and look, the political incentive too often, not just when it comes to commutations and pardons, but anything in our political system, the incentives are all with doing nothing,
right?
Not taking any risks, going with the flow. And obviously that's not how great leaders are made. But of course, with the McFadden case, as you note, that ruined not just the election, but the political career of then Lieutenant Governor Mark Singal, who was running for governor. And nobody wants to have that kind of record. But that said, we're just saying that CJ did not get a fair trial.
Understood.
And my dad is of the opinion that CJ could not have physically done this. I'm saying, look, I have my conclusions about whether or not there was an excess of reasonable doubt, and I invite people to read the Atlantic story to see how I came to that conclusion. But the bottom line is he didn't get a first fair trial.
You know, before you go, Dr. Tapper, your son was unable to coax out of you an answer to the question as to whether or not you, out of the kindness of your heart, have been financing part of the lawyering for Mr. Rice after this Weaver representation. Do you want to answer the question for me?
He had an initial lawyer after Weaver bowed out, and he is being paid as a defense attorney by the state or the city, whoever, and he now has a habeas corpus lawyer who saw CJ in prison today for the first time. And I talked to him maybe an hour ago, and he is very hopeful that a habeas corpus petition will be submitted next month. And that's one avenue. And the other avenue is the Board of Pardons of Pennsylvania. They have to vote unanimously, 5-0, a 4-1, 3-2 vote does not cut it. So either the Board of Pardons or habeas corpus are the two avenues open, and possibly the CIU will review the case with all the heat that's been put on publicly because of Jacob's article.
Are you financing part of that effort, Doctor?
Prefer not to answer.
I had a feeling you would. Jake, before you go, this piece, I assume, was not just written about C.J. Rice, but all the C.J. Rices that don't have two Tappers as their advocates. Is that a fair statement?
100%. I mean, once you see, and you know this obviously from your life's work, but once you see the unfairness in the criminal justice system, you cannot unsee it. Nobody wants guilty people walking the street. We just think that people are entitled to the same kind of justice that I would be able to afford or your viewers would be able to afford. So I believe that CJ is very unlucky, but he had the fortune of having a physician who is convinced of his innocence, who happened to have a son who is a journalist. But I can't even imagine how many people there are out there in prison cells all over the country, all over the world, that didn't have, even though they have bad luck, at least that small fortune.
Jake, your piece in the Atlantic is terrific. What's that? I'm sorry, doctor.
I was in a federal prison this morning because I periodically, monthly visit once or twice a month, visiting incarcerated individuals in federal prison. And there's no question in my mind that there are people who belong in state or federal prisons. That's not the issue in the CJ case. There are over 2 million Americans who are locked up. If 1% of them are innocent, that means we are locking up 20,000 people currently that we're doing.
Doctor, I want you to be my doctor, and it's good to meet you both. Jake, terrific piece in the Atlantic. I urge everybody to read it. Thanks for your time, gentlemen.
Thank you.